Imagine a quiet autumn morning in Melbourne in the year 1976. The city's bookmakers holding cash worth millions are ready for another day. But little did they know they're about to be hit by one of the most audacious heists in Australia's history as 6 masked men storm in, guns raised, and within minutes they make off with a fortune worth millions. Without a single shot fired and without a single arrest made, this is the story of Raymond Bennett and the Great Bookie Robbery. Raymond Chuck Bennett wasn't born into a life of luxury. Born in 1949 in the small town of Chiltern, Victoria, he saw firsthand the grind of working-class life. Ray didn't take after his dad's factory life, and instead his first steps were through the Painters and Dockers Union in 1963 thanks to his uncle. He was around 14 years old when he started ghosting on the docks, which meant he was faking timesheets so that some senior members could collect pay without lifting a finger. By the age of 19, he'd already clocked time breaking into houses, receiving stolen goods, and even cracking safes. He had an instinct for the game that outclassed even the older pros who'd taken him under their wing. At 20, Ray met the love of his life. She fell for him, totally unaware of the side business he was quietly running. They got married, and as she got closer to Ray's world, she started piecing together the truth about his extracurricular activities. When things got a little too hot with the Painters and Dockers back in Melbourne, who'd attracted enough police attention to become practically a household name in criminal investigations, Ray Bennett figured it was time to pack his bags and try his luck across the pond in Europe. In the 1960s, he was on his way to England. While there, he crossed paths with the Kangaroo Gang, a crew of Aussie expats who made a decent living raiding upmarket retail stores with low security. He struck up a friendship with Brian O'Callaghan, one of the Kangaroo members, and apparently joined in on their operations for a while. The Kangaroo Gang didn't just stick to the usual department store hauls, they also pulled off daylight robberies on jewelry shops. They'd walk in during business hours, dressed sharp enough to pass as corporate higher-ups, and take advantage of understaffed stores run by casual employees. They would then load up the valuables and stroll right out. This then led to Ray eventually having to face a conspiracy to commit armed robbery charge, which stemmed from a botched jewelry heist in England. The court wasn't impressed, sentencing him to 2 years in Parkhurst Maximum Security Prison on the Isle of Wight. In the early 1970s, Ray Bennett returned to Australia, allegedly to plan his biggest heist yet. Melbourne's bookmakers had been meeting at the Victorian Club's old premises on Queen Street for nearly a century. Every major race day, huge sums of cash were delivered by armored cars, and once inside, the security was practically non-existent. It all operated on trust. With millions of dollars lying around in cash, the place naturally caught the attention of people wanting to take it. But despite several gangs scoping it out, no one had the guts to follow through. The job seemed too risky and too complex. Then there was Ray Bennett. While no charges ever linked him directly to the Great Bookie Robbery, his name has been associated with it ever since. And it's not hard to see why. He had the guts, the brains, and the vision to see the heist for what it really was, a golden opportunity. It's said that Ray didn't take chances and didn't do half measures. He apparently spent months scoping out the building, noting every weakness and every escape route. But even Ray knew this wasn't a solo job. It would require a team, and the next step would be to gather a group of men who were as skilled, reliable, and trustworthy to pull it off. Over the years, plenty of theories have floated around about who exactly was part of this crew, with different sources naming different people. Most accounts agree there were 6 men involved, and the lineup likely included Ray Bennett himself, Norman Lee, Ian Carroll, Laurie Prendergast, Vinnie Mickelson, and Tony McNamara. There was also some talk about Dennis Smith being involved. Throughout the years, there have also been persistent rumors that the notorious Kane brothers, Brian and Les, were part of the crew. But through my research, that theory doesn't hold up. Whoever was part of that crew understood that pulling off a robbery like this wasn't just about a clever plan. It needed precision and endurance. So, the crew committed to stamina training and firearms practice, ensuring they could get in and out fast and to be able to handle a weapon with precision if needed. 3 months before the heist, the crew also rented an office on the 4th floor of the same building that housed the Victoria Club. This move was more than just convenient. It gave them a front row seat to the club's layout, routine, screens and security blind spots. They also rigged the building's lift to avoid drawing attention when it was out of order on heist day and filed down the fire escape door bolts for quick, easy access into the building when the time came. The crew didn't leave anything to chance. They meticulously planned each detail and even staged a full dress rehearsal while the club was conveniently empty over the Easter holiday. On April 26, 1976, an armored truck from Maine Nicholas was scheduled to deliver a hefty cash haul to the Victoria Club. The crew chose this date because it was post-Easter settling day, and bookmakers would be settling up after not one but 4 race meetings, which meant there would be more loot to score. The crew, outfitted with masks, coveralls, automatic weapons, and a sawed-off shotgun, waited patiently for the cash to be delivered to the second floor. Once it was, they kicked in the door of the fire escape and rushed up the stairs to the settling room, rounded up the hostages, and kept them on the ground without firing a single shot. Inside, they used bolt cutters to snap open the padlocks on the cash boxes and transferred the bills into their own bags for easy handling. The whole job took about 10 minutes. Instead of racing out in a blaze, the crew calmly took the cash upstairs to their rented office and stashed it in a safe. Then, they quietly walked out, blending in with the regular building traffic. To throw off any would-be investigators, they apparently even set up a fake getaway vehicle, complete with decoy bags, to make it look like the cash had left the building. However, rumor has it that the cash was safely stashed inside of the same building it was stolen from, and that the crew returned to collect it a month later. Once the crew made their escape, the club's secretary sounded the alarm. By then, it was a bit too late. Police finally showed up, and after a quick count, they reported a loss of about $1.5 million. That figure made this the biggest heist in Australia at the time. But the thing is, no one actually buys that as the true number. The bookmakers had every reason to keep the real amount under wraps. After all, they were still on the hook to pay tax on whatever was stolen, and the last thing they wanted was to fork over even more or to give the tax office any reason to start snooping around. Some folks in the underworld estimated it at around $10 million, and others put it closer to $15 million. But good luck getting an official count on that. Naturally, detectives got to work, and soon they started piecing together some details. The bolts on the fire exit had been delicately glued back, just enough to hold, making the door easier for a quick in and out. The police had to wonder if there was someone working together with the crew on the inside, but they never got enough proof to back it up, so that lead fizzled. A $70,000 reward was dangled out there by Maine Nicholas, hoping someone from Melbourne's underworld might come up with some information. Yet, despite the buzz, none of it really panned out. The only person ever charged but later acquitted was Norman Lung Lee, or Chops. The timing was a bit too coincidental to ignore. In the months leading up to the robbery, Lee had been practically begging for a loan to expand his dim sim factory. Banks, however, weren't biting. Yet not long after the Great Bookie robbery, he suddenly seemed to come into $270,000 cash. His accountant testified that Lee once arrived at his office with a cardboard box containing $50,000. A bit of a shock, considering Lee had previously asked him to arrange a loan. When asked about the cash, Lee casually claimed he just won it gambling. Lee's spending habits after the robbery only added to the intrigue. He was throwing cash around for home and factory renovations, and even put in an order for new machinery worth around $60,000. But despite all the circumstantial evidence, police couldn't link him directly to the heist. In the end, the charges against Lee were dismissed, and even though the authorities had a good idea of who was involved, they had no proof, and no one was ever convicted. After the Great Bookie robbery, some of Australia's more notorious underworld figures couldn't shake the feeling that they deserved a piece of the stolen money, especially the Kane brothers, Les and Brian. They were high-ranking members of the Painters and Dockers and felt that their standing and connections in the criminal world should entitle them to a cut. They started beefing with Ray Bennett, Laurie Prendergast and Vinnie Mickelson. The feud escalated quickly, and tensions boiled over one night in a drunken fight when Mickelson ended up biting off Brian Kane's ear. But ear or no ear, the Kanes weren't about to back down and were absolutely determined to take serious action on Ray and his crew if they didn't cough up the cash. The Painters and Dockers supported the Kanes, and the criminal world became very interested in the cash that was just sitting somewhere. As it turned out, though, a good portion of the money may have already been moved out of reach. Some sources suggest that Ray quietly stashed $6 million into a bank account in England under one of his son's names. He allegedly believed the different last name would keep the police from making the connection, at least for a while. The crew is also said to have invested in bars, properties, and other ventures, spreading their wealth overseas to make it harder for authorities to trace. In Australia, the police were still trying to piece everything together when Interpol got involved. In 1976, a $6 million deposit apparently surfaced in an account in England. While authorities strongly suspected the money was part of the bookie robbery haul, they couldn't connect all the dots. The crew, aware of the risk, stayed far away from the account, knowing the police didn't have enough solid evidence to act. By this stage, rumors were flying thick and fast, pointing to Ray as the mastermind behind the robbery, and everyone wanted a piece. On the night of October 19, 1978, Les Kane, his wife, and their children returned to their Wantirna unit after a family visit. His wife walked into the bedroom and found 3 gunmen lying in wait, each armed with a weapon. Les was in the bathroom when one of the men grabbed his wife, dragging her to another room. Meanwhile, the other 2 opened fire on Les. Les's body was loaded into the trunk of his unmistakable pink Ford Futura, which vanished along with him, never to be seen again. The 3 suspected gunmen were Ray Bennett, Vincent Mickelson, and Lawrence Prendergast. The Crown would later allege Ray, Mickelson, and Prendergast thought the Kanes would strike back and decided to get in first by taking out Les Kane. They were charged, but later acquitted in September 1979, primarily because Les's body was never found. Brian Kane wanted revenge, and he wasn't going to let his brother's disappearance go unanswered. It was November 12, 1979, and Ray was being led into Melbourne's Russell Street Courthouse for a hearing on armed robbery charges. Brian Kane knew Ray would be hard to reach if he got convicted and sent to prison, so he hatched a plan to hit him where he'd least expect it, in the courthouse itself. As a high-profile figure, Ray was escorted by the consorting squad when 3 shots came flying out of the crowd of people. 2 bullets tore through Ray's hands and 1 through his heart. Onlookers thought Ray was trying to escape, watching him stagger down the steps before collapsing. The ambush was so unexpected that even some of the police officers later admitted it felt like an inside job. Rumors later surfaced that a day before the execution, Brian Kane may have snuck into the court complex hidden in the boot of a cleaner's car for a dry run. Brian Kane had likely scouted the courthouse in advance, ensuring he'd have a way out. And sure enough, after the hit, whoever pulled the trigger vanished, slipping through an opening in the fence and catching a tram or getting a ride from someone to a getaway vehicle. Despite strong suspicions that Brian Kane pulled the trigger that day, possibly with the cooperation of corrupt police officers, no one was ever arrested or convicted, and the case remains unsolved. Brian Kane would meet a similar fate just 3 years later. It was November 26, 1982, when he was out having lunch in Melbourne with his friend. After stopping for a haircut and a few gin and tonics at the Tramway Hotel, they finally settled at the Quarry Hotel in Brunswick East, one of Kane's usual spots. As Kane sat near the jukebox, 2 men in balaclavas burst through the door, armed with .38 snub-nosed revolvers, the same type of weapon used in Ray Bennett's shooting. Kane tried reaching for a gun but wasn't fast enough. The shooters fired at close range, hitting Brian Kane in the head and chest. He was rushed to Royal Melbourne Hospital but passed shortly after on the operating table. Detectives suspected that Vinnie Mickelson and Laurie Prendergast were the most likely shooters, given their motives to prevent Kane from seeking further revenge for his brother's disappearance. The other 2 suspects were Russell Cox and Rodney Collins. However, nobody was ever charged. As for the rest of the crew allegedly involved in the heist, let's talk about Ian Carroll. In 1983, Ian Carroll and Cox got into an argument which allegedly ended in a shootout at what was meant to be a safe house in Mount Martha. Cox, despite taking a serious hit, managed to survive. Ian Carroll, however, wasn't so lucky. When the police found Ian's body, they also uncovered a massive arsenal of weapons at the house, which was considered one of the biggest illegal gun hauls ever made in Victoria. They also found large wooden boxes filled with armed robbery kits that included disguises, first aid equipment, and robbery plans. Russell Cox ended up getting charged for taking Ian's life, but the charge didn't make it past the committal proceedings, and it was dropped. As for Laurie Prendergast, he vanished on August 23, 1985, and his car was later found at Warrandyte. No one knows what happened to him. Some say that he fled overseas, while the police and family believe that someone made him disappear. As for Norman Lee, he continued in the business until July 1992, when he attempted a multi-million-dollar heist at Melbourne Airport's Ansett Freight Terminal, wearing a Michael Jackson mask with a partner in a Madonna mask. Police were onto them from the start, and as they tried to escape in a van, officers opened fire and Lee was hit in the head. Dennis Smith's heart gave out back in 2010. It's said that he was a key member of the planning team, had a hands-on role, and maybe even drove the van from the scene during the robbery, but we'll likely never know. Police say he laundered the loot, speculated to be more than $12 million, through an Aussie bar he ran in the Philippines. Vinnie Mickelson apparently fled to the western states and stayed there for many years, only returning east after everyone passed. And as for the Great Bookie robbery itself, officially no one was ever convicted for the heist. The case remains unsolved.